Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here tonight on what's turned out to be an unusually warm day in late October. My name is Pete Lapsey. I'm the Student Program Manager at the Center for Ethics and Culture, and so I have the privilege of engaging all of you wonderful Sorin Fellows in our Student Formation Program. And I'm really delighted to welcome you back kind of in a conversation from the small groups that you've had with our wonderful faculty over the course of the last few months. I'm especially delighted to welcome Professor Daniel Mahoney, who is this night's speaker and who is joining the center really for the course of this week at our fall conference, Higher Powers. Professor Mahoney will offer a standalone lecture as well as facilitate a discussion with Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn on Thursday evening, so I encourage all of you to attend. This Sorin Salon series was born out of an idea of our acting director from last semester, Professor Patrick Deneen, and so I'm just delighted to be able to continue with best idea I've ever had. And the Salon series, in large part, is just kind of an intellectual outgrowth of the way in which we try to approach student formation at the center, which is strictly relational, and so we try to kind of provide a foundation of friendship and community before we actually engage in intellectual conversation. And we think community and friendship are the conditions in which actual moral and intellectual formation can authentically happen. And so that's what happens in the Sorin Salon series, small, intimate groups where you can discuss with faculty these enduring pieces of literary reflection through the lens of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition. And so I find it particularly appropriate this semester that on the eve of the fall conference, we get to consider the work of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn and two of his most, I think, resounding contributions to Western moral discourse, A World Split Apart, which was his famous 1978 Harvard commencement address, as well as a lesser known, but I think equally important lecture, We Have Ceased to See the Purpose, which he delivered in 1993 to the International Academy of Philosophy. And so I speak on behalf of all of us, Professor Mahoney, that we're just so delighted that you're willing to be with us here tonight and this week to provide your insight on this really important figure who I think whose thought is especially relevant for us today, as it was in his time. But really pleased to introduce Sorin Fellow Nick Abushadid, who's going to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Mahoney.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Pete. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. Daniel Mahoney. Dr. Mahoney is a professor of political science at Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts. He received his Bachelor of Arts from the College of Holy Cross and his Master's and PhD at Catholic University of America in political science. In 1999, Professor Mahoney was the recipient of the prestigious Prix Raymond Aron. He's the associate editor of Perspectives in Political Science and book review editor. Executive. Pete wrote this.
My dear friend Peter Roller died, so I was promoted, but yes.
And book review editor for Society magazine. A renowned expert on French political philosophy, his books also include the critically acclaimed and especially relevant Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology. Professor Mahoney is the author of over 120 introductions, books, articles, and book reviews that have appeared in a wide range of scholarly and published journals. His writings have appeared in French, Italian, Russian, Hungarian, Norwegian, and Portuguese translations. As a reminder, on Thursday evening at 8 p.m. in McKenna Hall, Professor Mahoney will facilitate a discussion with Ignat Solzhenitsyn, the son of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, as the opening keynote address of the Center's Fall Conference. Professor Mahoney will also offer a standalone lecture at the Fall Conference at 10:45 on Saturday, November 3rd, titled From Ideological Lie to Freedom of Self-Restriction, Solzhenitsyn's Vision of the Soul and Politics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mahoney.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. The only thing I would add, I hold the Augustine Chair in Distinguished Scholarship, named after St. Augustine. And the man who endowed it has the last name Boulanger, and I do a lot of work, French politics and political thought, and Boulanger was a Napoleon Monque who staged a coup d'etat in 1889 trying to seize power, but he has a reputation for being sort of a buffoonish, failed Napoleon, and for this kind of pathetic poosh in 1889. So I told them, you can't name this chair after Boulanger. They'll mock me in France. So we decided on naming it after St. Augustine instead, which was much better. All right, well, I was very pleased to hear that you spent some time this first part of the semester reading these two great speeches by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. I think they're important speeches because they were important public interventions by Solzhenitsyn, efforts to speak to the Western world. Solzhenitsyn had gotten a first invitation from Harvard University in 1975 to speak at the university. He turned down many, many invitations, although he did strategically choose some. He spoke to the AFL-CIO at the invitation of George Meany in 1975 in Washington and New York. The AFL-CIO in those days was socially conservative and anti-communist. Things change. And Solzhenitsyn later on accepted the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion, gave a very important address in London in 1983. But these were, the Harvard address is probably Solzhenitsyn's most important effort to connect with, to speak to an American and Western public. It's interesting if one turns to the first volume of Solzhenitsyn's memoir about his years in the West. 18 of those 20 years were spent in American exile, 2 in Switzerland. Solzhenitsyn has I think a pretty fulsome account of the genesis of the Harvard Address, precisely what he said, many interesting comments about the occasion itself, but he also expresses some consternation about the disconnect between what he actually said and what he was accused of saying. And he says, there were no copyright restrictions. People could have republished the whole text, but he says, the newspapers cherry-picked. And in fact, in Between Two Millstones, there's a nice list of the various names Solzhenitsyn was called. He said, these are for the first few days, the scalding invective after he delivered the Harvard Address at Harvard Yard on June 8th, 1978. He has flung his gauntlet at the West, fanatic, orthodox mystic, fierce dogmatic, political romantic, conservative radical, reactionary speech, obsession. He has lost his balance, has missed the point, sounded like the wanderings of a mind split apart. Of course, that's a play on the title of the Harvard Address, the official title of which is A World Split Apart. And let me read you one other passage from Between Two Millstones. Solzhenitsyn's probably most eloquent and essential essay is a piece he wrote the day he was forcibly exiled from the Soviet Union. He was arrested. He thought he was going to the camps again, but he was sent to West Germany, eventually came to Switzerland, then to the United States. But Solzhenitsyn wrote an essay to his compatriots called Live Not by Lies, where he advocated non-participation in the mendacity, which was the glue that held the communist totalitarian system together. So no more pretending that the nonsense you heard in the universities were true. No more denouncing your fellow workers for alleged crimes. No more repeating ideological cliches that have no real meaning, etc., etc. So Solzhenitsyn wasn't calling so much for heroism, but as a non-participation of the soul in the lies that were just as consequential as the violence that held up and sustained 70 years of Soviet totalitarianism. But it's interesting, Solzhenitsyn says in Between Two Millstones, before my Harvard speech, I naively believed that I had found myself in a society where one can say what one thinks, the vaunted freedom of speech of our Western societies, without having to flatter that society. It turns out democracy expects to be flattered. When I called out "live not by lies" in the Soviet Union, that was fair enough. But when I called out "live not by lies" in the United States, I was told to take a hike. All right, so a little colloquial speech there. And by the way, I think if we read the Harvard address closely, it's very apparent, contrary to the silly, tendentious media reports that Solzhenitsyn collected and criticized in Between Two Millstones. It's pretty apparent Solzhenitsyn is speaking as a friend. You'll remember how the speech begins. He says the motto of Harvard is veritas, truth. And he says he's going to speak some bitter truths, but he also says that he speaks as a friend and not an adversary, a friend of the West. I can tell you, as somebody who studied these matters for many, many years, that the immediate press reports, the responses to the Harvard address. There's an interesting book published by the Ethics and Public Policy Center called Solzhenitsyn at Harvard. It has early responses, and then it has later, more considered responses. And there's a few very good ones, but there's mainly very bad ones. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the famous historian and the propagandist for Camelot under President Kennedy, he was comparing Solzhenitsyn to every Puritan he could think of, and Richard Pipes, a Pole who never much liked Russia before the communists and during communism or after communism, compared Solzhenitsyn to Pobedonostsev, who was the procurator of the Orthodox Church and was really a nasty reactionary figure. Solzhenitsyn says, I have no admiration for Pobedonostsev and I never read him. But never mind. So the fact that the Harvard address was intended to be a friendly message to the West, spoken by a friend to a civilization in crisis, I think was missed by not all, but by the vast majority of commentators. And I think it gave rise to the legend that Solzhenitsyn was anti-American, that Solzhenitsyn disliked the West as much as he disliked communist totalitarianism. I don't think that's true. But, and clearly Solzhenitsyn identified not with what he called current modernity, or what some people would call late modernity or radical modernity. The West he identified was an older West, as he puts it in the Harvard address, with its rich reserves of mercy and sacrifice. So, and by the way, there was nothing specifically Russian about his critique of the endless self-radicalization of the West. Prominent political philosophers for a long time have warned us. I can name 6 or 7 of them who've had a major influence on my own thinking. Western political philosophers who have warned us that the West is losing its connection with an older moral capital, with the classical and Christian foundations of our own civilizations. As I say, there is nothing at all specifically Russian or Slavophile about that critique. You read the Western press and most of the Russianists, you're either a Westernizer who believes that Russia should follow slavishly the least admirable and least prudent and least salutary aspects of the West, or you're an autocratic Slavophile. Well, in the Russian tradition, there are many figures, people like Berdyaev and Soloviev and many others, I think Solzhenitsyn is in this tradition, who think that Russia has much to learn from the best features of the West, which are not always the most current features of the West. So I think that's all important to keep in mind. I just want to very briefly outline and highlight some of the principal themes of the Harvard Address. It is true that Solzhenitsyn's critique of the decline in courage as the most striking feature of the contemporary West was tied up with some immediate political fears he had that the West was losing its nerve. In the Nobel Prize address of 1972, he speaks about the spirit of Munich repeating itself. He feared that the Western democracies were not capable of a prudent and proud and principled defense of human freedom. But I think the critique goes deeper. I think Solzhenitsyn thought that a civilization based on the priority of the pursuit of happiness, understood idiosyncratically or hedonistically, could not sustain the patrimony of Western civilization. That a society that inordinately valued physical and material well-being would paradoxically undermine the spiritual and moral strength of the Western tradition. Even biology tells us that a high degree of habitual well-being is not advantageous to a living organism. Today, well-being in the life of Western society has begun to take off its pernicious mask. So Solzhenitsyn had doubts about a society that was so inordinately dedicated to the pursuit of happiness, understood crudely and reductively, and to material well-being at the expense of the cultivation of the human soul. I think another misunderstanding about the Harvard Address was that Solzhenitsyn was simply attacking the rule of law. And this is where the Russian experts came in, and the Slavophiles would talk about the importance of sobernost, a kind of community, and downplay the legalism of the inordinate legalism of the Western tradition. But note these words from page 366 in the Solzhenitsyn Reader. I have spent all my life under a communist regime, and I will tell you that a society without any objective legal scale is a terrible one indeed. And for those of you who haven't made your way through the 1,500 pages and 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago, read the authorized abridgment. There are 2. One prepared by Edward Erickson in 1983-84 with the help of Solzhenitsyn. It's 500 pages. And about a 700 or 800 page abridgment prepared by Natalia Solzhenitsyn for Russians, but that is also available in a French translation. They're both wonderful abridgments. All the essentials are there. The last chapter of the Gulag Archipelago is called There Is No Law. So Solzhenitsyn understands the value of rule of law to a decent society, but he thinks Our litigious, legalistic society is a corruption and a degeneration of what the Europeans used to call a Rechtsstaat, a rule of law state. I think everything Solzhenitsyn says about the press is true, about its inordinate power in our democracy, about the way it subverts democratic self-government, but also one of the most attacked remarks in Solzhenitsyn spoke about a false slogan of a false era, the public's right to know. And he said, in fact, we have a more fundamental right, the right not to know, not to have our divine souls stuffed with gossip, nonsense, vain talk. You know, that didn't go over with the press. And by the way, since the press was leading the first wave of initial interpretation of the Harvard Address, and Solzhenitsyn was so frank, blunt, open, and truthful about our press and its, you know, people talk about free speech, but as Harvey Mansfield points out in a brilliant article in the new issue of National Affairs, nobody knows what speech is. Its connection to reason, you know, and its role in Republican self-government. You know, that's why we have courts who think that, you know, burning the flag or engaging in pornography is a form of speech, because they don't know the difference between speech and expression. And these were all things that concerned Solzhenitsyn. One other thing I wanted to highlight from page 369, Solzhenitsyn makes very clear that he talks about his partial critique of the contemporary West. But he says, don't get me wrong. My partial critique of the Western system is in no way an endorsement of socialism as an alternative. And Solzhenitsyn believed that socialism confiscated human liberty, undermined the productive foundations of free societies, tended toward the centralization and concentration of power, and had, at best, autocratic tendencies, and at worst, full-fledged totalitarian ones. Now, I think the spiritual and intellectual core of the Harvard Address is the discussion of humanism and its consequences, or what I might call a humanitarianism and its consequences. If there is a lie at work in the modern West that provides some kinship with the awful totalitarian political alternatives of the 20th century, I put it this way. The modern West is afflicted by a civil war, a culture war, that's really very fundamental. Are our liberties under God and the law, as Tocqueville famously put it in the third part of The Old Regime and the Revolution? Or is the proper intellectual and spiritual foundation of free government autonomy, or what Solzhenitsyn calls anthropocentricity, man-centered, the human will as at the center of the human world? And Solzhenitsyn argues, I think one has to read these pages, 372 to 374, very carefully, because he argues that a humanism devoid of deference to something above us is incapable of confronting the challenges of our time. And for Solzhenitsyn, perhaps the deepest weakness of anthropocentricity or autonomy or rationalistic humanism, as he called it, is the failure to acknowledge intrinsic evil in human beings, or what Solzhenitsyn sometimes calls the drama of good and evil in the human soul, which is a great theme of the two most consequential chapters of the Gulag Archipelago, which you all need to go out and read, The Blue Caps and The Ascent. But that is, humanism cannot confront the evil in the human soul, and it cannot confront the need for divine grace to elevate and redeem a wounded humanity. By the way, coming back to this theme of whether or not the Harvard Address is in any way anti-American, on page 573, Solzhenitsyn says, in early democracies, before modernity radicalized itself, he says, in American democracy, there was a time when all individual rights were granted on the ground that man is God's creature. That is, freedom was given to the individual conditionally in the assumption of his constant religious responsibility. And later on that same page, Solzhenitsyn comments quite strikingly, I think, about a total emancipation that has occurred from the moral heritage of the West, of Christian centuries. And this is the phrase I quoted before. With their great resources of mercy and sacrifice, state systems have become ever more materialistic. So Solzhenitsyn speaks favorably about American democracy at its beginnings, because the balance between materialistic and spiritualist conceptions, the tying of freedom to self-restraint, to religious responsibility, to self-limitation, was publicly and privately acknowledged by statesmen, by citizens, by churchmen, by ordinary Americans. But Solzhenitsyn has some very rich passages about this, what I've talked about, this sort of endless self-radicalization of modernity. And he says, and I think this is very astute, why did so many Western intellectuals praise communism as more democratic, more progressive, more rational, more humane, more emancipatory than the comparatively moderate democracies of the West? And they did so because communism was more consistently anthropocentric, material. It was more consistently modern. And that's, I think, all of us who want to defend liberal democracy and want to defend the political, spiritual patrimony of the West need to appreciate we're defending something that is only worthy of our full commitment and is only truly morally estimable when we don't love it too much, when it doesn't carry out the logic of modernity toward a full-fledged godlessness, materialism, anthropocentricity. But intellectuals, just a little quick précis. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote in Libération in Paris in 1951, freedom of criticism is so total in the Soviet Union that they have no need for elections. 1962, he went to Cuba. Gallimard has reissued his Cuban writings. I would not waste your time, but if you want to see sycophancy at the service of tyranny, read Sartre's Cuban writings. Soon there were Chinese writings. You all know Michel Foucault, the great denizen of sexual liberation, the evils of Western prisons and institutionalization. He had a Maoist period during the Cultural Revolution, and later he praised the Iranian Revolution of '79 because of all the emancipation it would bring to women. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not being polemical. These are simply facts. My friend Paul Hollander has written a book called Political Pilgrim, just tracing the myriad numbers of intellectuals and churchmen who paid tribute to, praised, endorsed, murderous, thuggish, totalitarian regimes of the left. Two of the biggest bozos around now are Alain Badiou, the Parisian Marxist, the advocate of something called l'idée de communisme, The practice hasn't worked, but the idea is still good. He just rewrote Plato's Republic as a kind of Leninist tract, but he has actually written a set of critical commentaries on Mao Zedong's discourses during the Cultural Revolution. And then there's the silly Slovenian Zizek, who wrote a book called In Defense of Lost Causes. The lost causes include Robespierre. They include Heidegger in 33, who supposedly was onto something when he praised Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, etc. I assure you, Badiou, Zizek, Sartre are better read in our prestige universities than Solzhenitsyn. Last word about the Harvard Address. Solzhenitsyn never calls for a return to the past. One of my favorite quotes is from Nietzsche. He doesn't have much in common with Solzhenitsyn, but there's some wisdom there and a lot of rhetoric. Nietzsche says, "Whisper to the conservatives, only a crab can crawl backwards." We're not going back to the medieval village. But Solzhenitsyn says, the very final words of the Harvard Address, "We have no place to go but up from modernity, authentic postmodernism." He says, in the Middle Ages, there was a tendency to disparage the material nature of man. There was a kind of despotism of the spiritual. But in Europe since the Renaissance, there has been an ignoring of the spiritual countenance and the spiritual contents of human life. So hence the famous final words of the address, "If the world has not approached its end, it has reached a major watershed in history, equal in importance to the turn from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will demand from us a spiritual blaze. We shall have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life, where our physical nature will not be cursed as in the Middle Ages, but even more importantly, our spiritual being will not be trampled upon as in the modern era." And by the way, you probably noticed in both the 1993 address, "We have ceased to see the purpose," and the Harvard Address, Solzhenitsyn talks an awful lot, repeatedly, and I think very eloquently, about something called voluntary self-limitation or self-restraint. He's not talking about what political autocracy. He's not talking about coercion. He's talking about the capacity of free men and women to exercise their liberty in a spirit of natural virtue and religious responsibility. The end of the 1993 address, Solzhenitsyn says, "We have thrown the golden key of self-restraint to the ocean floor, and we've got to get it back." So again, he's calling for a spiritual blaze. He's calling for a spiritual and cultural renewal of our Christian civilizations. He's not calling for a political revolution. He's not calling for a regime change, but he is calling for a turn in our thinking that might be comparable to the turn of thinking that occurred from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. Just a couple of other quick points. Solzhenitsyn does say in the Harvard Address that he would not suggest the contemporary United States or Western Europe as a model for his own countrymen. On the other hand, in the 1993 address, "We have ceased to see the purpose," he speaks about the need for Westerners to have confidence in their own principles that value individual independence and the rule of law. In Between Two Millstones, he speaks about just how much Russia can learn not from the contemporary and rather jaded and decadent culture of the United States and Western Europe, but from our civic experience. We have something to teach the rest of the world about governing ourselves. And in his farewell address to the townspeople of Cavendish, Vermont, Solzhenitsyn said he most admired the civic experience, the serious moral and civic experience of self-government that he saw in Switzerland and in the New England towns. And he says Russia very much needs this. Instead of imposing some adopted and model of Western democracy from the top down, traditions of citizenship have to grow from the bottom up. A couple of other points about the 1993 address. I think there's a lot of subtlety there. It's easy to see Solzhenitsyn as a moralist who criticizes Machiavellian morality. But he does say we can't simply apply criteria from personal life, moral judgments, to the level of politics and states. On the other hand, he does reject a Machiavellian view that says those moral judgments are inappropriate at the highest political levels. He says there's going to be some distortion, and yet one fatal mistake in the modern world is to have severed much too radically and too completely moral and political criteria. Secondly, the text has some very rich reflections about progress. Solzhenitsyn says, at least 3 times in that We Have Ceased to See the Purpose text, that modern progress can't be stopped. At the same time, he says, we should never identify technological progress with moral progress. He also says that we have to turn modern progress toward the perpetration of the human good. So these are very, very rich reflections. We live in this modern world. It would be antisocial to say we're going to escape from technology, we're going to escape from industrialism, we're going to escape from science. But how do we begin to turn these tools toward the perpetration of the human good? And I think there's much to reflect on in the paragraph where Solzhenitsyn speaks about modern man having ceased to see the purpose. And I'm going to end just by reading that paragraph. After speaking about the limits of infinite progress, Solzhenitsyn says, no, all hope cannot be pinned on science, technology, or economic growth. The victory of technological civilization has also instilled in us a spiritual insecurity. You know, the people out in the Silicon Valley are waiting for the great singularity in 2039. Ray Kurzweil and the others, they're going to downbrain their brains and consciousness into a computer, and they're going to live forever, you know? Are you excited about the great singularity? No. It's a fraud. Technological civilizations, gifts enrich, but enslave us as well. All is interest. We must not neglect our interests. All is struggle for material things. But an inner voice tells us that we have lost something pure, elevated, and fragile. We have ceased to see the purpose. I will add, Solzhenitsyn never uses doctrinaire or sectarian language. God is a whole and higher authority, the supreme spirit. There's nothing specifically orthodox or even Christian about his rhetoric when he evokes providence in these 2 texts. I think that's quite deliberate. He knows he's speaking to a wider audience. Of course, that language does not mean that that is his final word. And notice at the very end of the Liechtenstein address, we have ceased to see the purpose. Solzhenitsyn attacks the naive fable about the happy arrival of the end of history. The illusion that humankind will settle into what Solzhenitsyn calls all democratic bliss. And Solzhenitsyn thought, I think, that that was nonsense. He makes clear that there can only be one true progress, the sum total of the spiritual progresses of individuals. So these speeches, I think at their deepest level, they're challenges to the modern lie, not just the communist ideological lie, but the lie that says we are progressing, that we don't need God, that we can root our freedom in anthropocentricity and autonomy. But it's also a call for us to recover the spiritual foundations of human freedom, the salutary key of self-restraint, a humble deference, or he says the altogether forgotten sense of humility before a providential God. So, of course, the commentators did not want to look at those things. That would involve reflection, talking about the things of the soul. So it was much easier to talk about Bétante, or Solzhenitsyn was trying to bring about World War III, and hence Solzhenitsyn's words that he was dumbfounded by the absolute disconnect between what he argued and what was claimed he argued. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more to talk about, but I hope that gives you a sense of some of the enduring themes of these two speeches that are worth talking about and reflecting, and I guess I'll take some questions.
Yeah, I think we have time for about one or two questions if anyone has a question for the purposes of the
Don't be shy.
Hi, my name is Sorin. I'm a senior here studying great books.
Sorin?
Like Kierkegaard.
Oh, you're not Father Sorin. You're Sorin Kierkegaard. Okay.
I'm Sorin the Sorin.
Okay.
My question is about the
I'm glad you're, never mind.
I'm not named after the dorm. I do get that question a lot. My question is about the use of the West and as a sort of as a history, as a concept. It seems like Solzhenitsyn tends to, obviously he's speaking about, at some points, about the modern West, but then he also says that there's a, like as you, I think you quoted this section actually, like a rich tradition and a rich history that we're adopting, but that we need to preserve. What exactly is that West? If you had to sort of pick out a timeline, does it end at the end of the Renaissance, at the end of the medieval period, does he include the Enlightenment? I think that adds a crucial sort of element to what we are to preserve or what we are to defend or return to if we're talking about sort of.
Yeah, I don't think Solzhenitsyn even wants us to repudiate the whole of the Enlightenment, where he says there's nothing we can do to stop progress, nor should we. Modern scientific progress, technological progress is, in a sense, is deeply indebted to Enlightenment. But don't forget, Enlightenment was an ideological project. When the French said Lumière, the lights, Charles Péguy, the great French Catholic poet and philosopher, once said, what's inherent in that view? All was darkness until January 1st, 1789, and then electricity. Or Kant speaks about the spiritual maturation of the human race, So this image that, and people on the other side in the counter-enlightenment would talk about the Enlightenment as the great endarkenment, because we forgot about our souls. So both views, I think, go too far in one view or one direction or the other. But I think, Solzhenitsyn is obviously not an intellectual historian or a political philosopher, although these speeches touch on great and enduring themes of political philosophy. But I think he thinks for an awful long time the Enlightenment coexisted with an older view of political and moral responsibility. And really, in the course of the last century, that tradition with its rich reserves and mercy and sacrifices has, in some cases, like with Marxism, been expressly and emphatically repudiated. But in the liberal West, it's sort of waned away, and I don't know if I'd go as far as Professor Deneen, but, we in America, we in the Christian West have adopted certain conceptions of rights and certain that are tied up with what Solzhenitsyn calls anthropocentricity. And for a long time, we sort of managed to navigate that tension pretty well. But I think the chickens have come home to roost, and we're really seeing that. I think the status quo is not sufficient, that there has to be, as Solzhenitsyn calls it, a spiritual blaze, and that means a movement up from modernity. We have to build. The point is not to repudiate the rule of law, not to repudiate constitutional government, not to repudiate political freedom. The goal, however, is to enrich our spiritual understanding of human life. And that means to reconnect freedom to self-limitation, but also to a self-conscious affirmation of that which is above and grounds the whole of things, human life, the human spirit, and that means, I think, a sense of providence, so I don't know if the genealogy is all that important as it is to know that this 2 or 3 century effort to put together essentially contradictory understandings of human freedom has failed. And there is going to have to be a much more self-conscious effort to build human liberty on expressly new intellectual and spiritual foundations. Another one? Oh, yes.
Hi. So
You were sort of hiding over there.
my name is Teresa. I'm a senior here. So
What are you studying?
history and theology.
Okay.
Thank you for your talk. I guess my question is, what is the vehicle of the spiritual laser renewal? Is it going to be religion? Is it going to be Christianity, or is it going to be a combination of intellectual, return to intellectual tradition, and then academics? So who's going to be responsible for
I don't have much hope for the academic world being at the heart of civilizational renewal. My friend Roger Scruton has a wonderful phrase that I have shamelessly taken over from him: the culture of repudiation. When you go to college, maybe not so much at Notre Dame, because it seems at Notre Dame. It seems like at Notre Dame, didn't you correct me on this? He did in Paris a year and a half ago. I was told I cannot say Notre Dame. Notre. It seems to me at a university like this, there are still living embers of the old wisdom and the old tradition. It's not just dying out, and there's certainly there's a very strong progressivist camp here, but there's a conservative camp in the non-political sense of wanting to conserve the patrimony and wisdom of our civilization. But I think Catholic colleges are, on the whole, in pretty pathetic shape. They're much more committed, the theme of my new book, to a kind of facile social activism, this worldly project of world amelioration. The church is a collective NGO and beautiful soul, de-emphasizing classical and Christian learning, and kind of, Jacques Maritain in the middle of the Second Vatican Council, and he was a progressive before the council. He said, we've got to stop kneeling before the world. We have to be courageous witnesses to the truth of the gospel, and not simply feeling guilty and accommodating, the moderate nihilisms that, surround us. So I don't know if it's going to come from the universities, but certainly, a guy named Treadgold has just written. He's a famous medieval. He's ever come to CC? Warren Treadgold. He's a medieval a Byzantine scholar. He's written these wonderful books on the Byzantine Empire and Church. But he's written a new book published by Encounter on like rebuilding a serious elite university where we really study philosophy and theology and non-ideological history, and where political correctness doesn't define how we interact with each other. And this is a thought experiment. It's not going to happen. But we have to be bold. And my guess is such a spiritual blaze or spiritual renewal is not going to come from our tired official institutions, maybe even the church, but it's going to come from individuals who make a difference. And I think Solzhenitsyn was such an individual. I think, when I travel around the country, I see that his life and legacy and writing inspire. It's quite a remarkable story. You know how when this man was arrested in 1945 as a captain in the Red Army in East Prussia, he was a dogmatic Leninist. He tells us in his poem, Doroshenka, that he got up early in his honeymoon in 1941 to read Das Kapital. Don't do that. Don't get up early to read Das Kapital, please. But, the scales of ideology fell from his eyes in the camps, and he, in the chapter the Ascent, there's a beautiful, beautiful poem about his recovery of faith in the living God. But it took, which also meant a recovery of a much deeper anthropology, one where evil is real. I mentioned that before. I think this humanitarian Christianity that we confront, it's not a world where evil lives. It's a world where everyone's nice and non-judgmental. What is moralistic, therapeutic deism? I think that's most soi-disant Christians are moralistic, theistic deists, who want to be nice, who want to be tolerant, and want the world to be a nice place. And we got to do better than that. So anyway.
I think that's a great way to end, actually. So we're actually out of time, but I hope it's just the beginning of the discussion, given that the conference will kind of facilitate these exact kind of discussions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
For